Good afternoon. For those who don't know me, my name is Evelyn Farkas. I'm the relatively new executive director of the McCain Institute. Thank you. Just so everybody knows that this is a very balanced, politically balanced panel, I'm just going to mention the fact that I ran unsuccessfully for Congress as a Democrat in the great state of New York. I'm saying that because we also have our New York State Senator here, Senator Gillibrand. I lost, and I am now at the nonpartisan McCain Institute. So that is how we are balancing our panel.
It's good enough for me. Worse.
Excellent. So welcome, Senator Jim Risch from Idaho, senior senator. You have 3 terms in the Senate. You are our most senior Republican foreign policy maker in the United States of America.
You sound really
hadn't thought about
sound old, you know?
Representative McCaul, representing the 10th District of Texas, you are also one of the 2 senior members of our government representing the Republic as a Republican in our government making foreign policy. If I did my math right, you've both been in office around the same time because you have 9 terms and you have 3 terms. So if you would like, just for a few minutes, and I understand we only have 30 minutes, total, with your questions included. If you could just reflect on what it means at this moment in time. We have a Democratic president in office. We have the 2 of you very experienced, seasoned gentlemen with a lot of responsibility at this moment in time when we are being challenged by authoritarian large powers and all kinds of other crises, you know, all over the world, to include even in our backyard in Haiti. So if you could just, you know, take a few minutes to start us off, Senator Risch.
Well, I guess one of the things that strikes me in reflecting back on this is how quickly things move. I mean, we were here all in the same room a year ago, and we were mostly talking about China at that time. And of course now our eye's been taken off that ball, and we're facing a very serious challenge in Ukraine. But if you go back over the years, we just kind of go from crisis to crisis, and it's always different, and it's dynamic, and it's always changing. Over the top of all this is what we talked about last time, and that is China. The rise of China is the big story in foreign relations, has been for a decade or more. And as we look forward, regardless of what happens in Ukraine, China's going to be there. And of course, China's watching this, and how this plays out is going to make a difference there. But China is still, China's going to be our competitor economically, militarily, culturally, over the rest of this decade.
Yeah, the way I see it is we've had a lot of little wars, right? But this is a great power competition that's happening right now. We looked at what happened in Afghanistan, and then Putin started putting his troops around Ukraine not too long after that. And we know Chairman Xi, Communist China, has intentions on Taiwan. And then we have the Ayatollah in North Korea. But my father was a bombardier on a B-17, 32 bombing missions over the Nazis. And, you know, this, to me, it's almost like history sort of repeating itself. There were so many parallels to that time. You know, when I was in Poland on the Ukraine border, they talked about 1939 a lot. Like, this reminded them of when Hitler invaded Poland. And it's the largest invasion in Europe since World War II. And now we know Chairman Xi is being very aggressive with Taiwan. He already has a security agreement with the Solomon Islands at John Kennedy PT 109. So if you look at it from that perspective, it's almost like they're trying to redraw the maps that my father's generation liberated.
Mm-hmm. Well, since you both mentioned China, I'd like to start with China. The national security strategy, U.S. national security strategy, came out recently, remarked on the fact that China is trying to remake the international order, rewrite the rules to basically help them, benefit them. But that somehow the U.S. is going to manage the relationship with China while it's also trying to, you know, compete against us pretty aggressively. How do we do that in a way that doesn't somehow get us inadvertently into war, let's say, over Taiwan? And how do we do that in a way where we don't end up overly protectionist? The last panel was on this, you know, technology and the need to protect our technology and our national security, our edge. But how do we manage the relationship with China, both the military, political relationship, as well as the economic relationship? And I'll start with you, Senator Risch.
Well, I think that relationship is fluid right now, and I think it's fluid because what we're seeing in the world today is countries breaking into, are they democracies or are they autocracies? And the autocracies seem to be hanging together. You have Russia, and of course they've teamed up with China, teamed up with Iran. And on our side are the democracies. And we're all trying to operate within a world that is under a new order since in recent decades, and I think that's a challenge for us. I think we're going to have to learn to work with autocratic governments. We don't like them. They're not. They have mostly no use for human rights. They have a very different view of how to govern, and so I think it's fluid, and I think it's going to take some years of pushing and shoving before we get to a point where we can coexist and do business on the planet and each manage our own security situation. I think it's going to be some time, and I think there could be some real bumps in that as we go down the pike.
Representative McCaul.
No, that's a great question. I had a really great discussion with Secretary James Baker about China. And I know,
Recently?
Yeah.
Wow,
I mean,
okay.
after I came back from Ukraine and spoke at Rice at the Baker Institute, and I said, I know you tried to work with China to get them in the family of nations, and they did under Bush 41. And, we gave them a lot of stuff. And in his words, he said, sadly, it just didn't work. And we have to open our eyes, particularly after the pandemic with supply chain, which is why we passed the Chips for America Act. And these two were very helpful and, to get this thing done so we can make semiconductor chips in the United States, right, to protect it. And we got to look at rare earth minerals. They're in 140 different countries. They're actually in Afghanistan right now. China is $1 trillion of lithium, and we'll probably get access to Bagram Air Base, which personally doesn't make me happy. It's a bad result. But I think to answer your question, nobody wants war with China, and I don't think they do either. And so I think the way it's deterrence, which is why we need to sell these weapons to Taiwan. We just met with their delegation, but it's deterrence, but competition. Too often we're just not on the field, right? We're not in Africa. 20 nations have sworn their allegiance to China now. And why are you doing this? Well, because you're not here. Latin America, another good example. Both ends of the Panama Canal and Indo-Pacific. And so we got to learn, we can't just call them, the people of China are good people. The communist China government's not so great, but we just got to learn how to be more competitive. And in technology, I think your last panel was discussing, that's how we win too. They're investing $1 trillion in their technology, digital economy, AI, quantum, 5G, semiconductors, all that. And we got to compete.
Yeah. Well, I think we will compete, obviously, and the trick is to maintain deterrence so that China doesn't think twice about taking military action against Taiwan, which leads me to Russia, but I'm not going to ask you about Russia because I'm looking at this countdown and we don't have a lot of time. You gentlemen are both on the record very strongly speaking out the need to defend Ukraine and its sovereignty, not just because Ukraine, of course, has that right, but because it's about the international order. We need to defend our international order. And so I'm going to switch now and ask you about Iran and North Korea. So this morning we heard very passionately that what's happening in Iran today is different, that it's a revolution. And we heard description attributed to President Obama saying maybe he could have done more when the Green Revolution occurred. We know that with Iran and with most countries, it's best if the revolution and the change comes from the people. But now they're making change. What do you think the United States can and should do at this moment in time with regard to Iran? And I guess I'll start with Representative McCaul to to shake it up a little.
I mean, they are the pariah in the Middle East. And the Iran deal, you know, when Iran wants them, the IAEA to shut down their investigation where they found 3 undisclosed sites with, you know, radioactive particles is, I think, a bad deal. But they are the problem in the Middle East to Israel and the Arab nations. The Abraham Accords is a good step forward, but I think we've got a great opportunity. Now, not since the Green Revolution that you're referring to put priority over the revolution rather than an Iran deal that will legalize their nuclear, you know, program. And so, you know, with that, how do you do that, right? We're not going to send our people in there, but communication. So Starlink works so well in Ukraine. That's the only reason that Zelensky can talk to the world now. We got Starlink in Iran, and the antennas are up. And that communication that is not subject to surveillance or censor, free communication without the regime monitoring it, both inside and outside of Iran is, in my judgment, the best way to build a resistance, you know, to the regime. And the regime is very nervous right now because the 22-year-old woman who was killed by the morality police because her hijab wasn't perfectly on her head is starting, it's all about women's rights now. And I'm telling you, the regime is very nervous about this. And all the while, you know, we just got reporting that Iran's working with Russia to help them build drones in Russia. And all the while, they're sending their own drones to Crimea, which is a whole nother discussion. I wish we had longer range artillery to take those out in Crimea that we don't currently. But the fact is, it's the Iranian drones that are killing innocent Ukrainians right now.
Yeah, and it goes to show how everything is so interconnected, because if Russia were stopped and if Russia no longer had an aggressive foreign policy, that would change things for Iran and Syria and even Afghanistan.
And China, our ambassador said it's the biggest deterrence to China is if we win in Ukraine.
Exactly. So, Senator Risch, can you add to this? And if you want to throw in any other elements here.
It's striking when you look at there's 193 members of the UN, about the number of countries that are on the planet, and it's only a handful that we have troubles with. And they all have in common the same thing, that they're autocracies, no respect for human rights, no democracy. The people there don't have any kind of civil rights at all. But what should we do about Iran? Look, this is no secret with me. I fought with the Obama administration, and I've been fighting with the Biden administration. Why in the world would you be sitting at the table negotiating with people like that? And they want to confine it to just their nuclear activities. These people, the Iranians have a list as long as your arm of the bad things that they do. And what we ought to do right now is we ought to walk away from the negotiations that are going on, and secondly, crank up the sanctions that we have and really enforce those sanctions. And we got all the reason to do it now. You watch what's going on in the streets. They got death penalty that they've put on people that are protesting. These are the people you want to negotiate with? I mean, it's just nonsense.
So we have 13 minutes left. I have so many more questions. If anyone in the audience wants to ask about North Korea, what should we do about North Korea? They basically have said they're going to be a nuclear power, and lobbed another missile, another ICBM test yesterday, and they've been doing dozens of these tests. But I'm not going to ask about North Korea because unless you want to really quickly say in 1 minute something about North Korea.
1 minute, solve the whole problem.
Please.
Well, he's back to his games again. He's fired rockets over Japan. He's a threat to Taiwan. We just talked to that delegation, and you know, again, I think we need to make it clear as a doctrine policy of the United States that a nuclear Iran or North Korea is not acceptable to the free world.
Mm-hmm. Senator Risch?
Well, I'm on the Intelligence Committee, and most of what I know about this I can't tell you. But I will say this. Look, we've got the intelligence agencies in our country that are looking over this very carefully. As a result of that, we do have the plans that you need to make for this kind of thing, and I am very comfortable with where we are as far as the oversight of what's happening there and our responsiveness.
Okay, I've seen 3 hands go up. Oh my gosh, too many hands. So I think I'll just take a hand from each section, and I'll ask you to give your question. We're gonna take 3 questions in a row, and just hold your fire, hold your answers until all 3 have gone. So right there, the gentleman in the tie on the aisle.
Thank you. I'm Dennis Kwok. I'm a former democracy legislator from Hong Kong. And looking at things from the Hong Kong point of view, we really now understand that the takeover of Hong Kong in 2020 by Xi Jinping was really part of his plan of the preparing for decoupling with the West, tearing up an international treaty, and now with intentions over Taiwan. So my question is, how is the United States and the international community going to prepare for a decoupling? Because it is happening, and the other side is actively preparing the foundations for it. How are you going to react to that?
Okay, right there.
Mark Hetfield, I'm the president of HIAS, which is the Jewish Community's refugee agency. The situation for Afghan refugees has not improved since we were last here a year ago, both for those tens of thousands in the United States who still have no permanent status in the US, as well as for the tens of thousands left behind and who are on lily pads. Where do you see the US showing leadership this year for Afghan refugees, and do you see Congress passing the Afghan Adjustment Act this year?
Okay, and then the third one, right here towards the front. Unless we had a woman, I would throw it to a woman, but.
I'm not a woman. I'd like to ask a question coming out of the last session, which was on emerging technologies, and one of the points was the importance of democracies working together in the development of these new technologies and ways to defend ourselves against their applications as well. One of the questions was, how can the United States reassure its closest allies that its policies will be inclusive of its allies and not protectionist and exclusive of its allies? I didn't hear an answer to that question in the last panel, and I would be fascinated to hear yours. Thank
Okay,
you.
great. So it's decoupling, Taiwan decoupling, Afghan refugees, and don't leave our allies behind on trade. We'll start with the senator.
Kind of a stew, isn't it?
You
want to take
can
these
pick
one
and
at a
choose, I
time?
suppose, but.
Yeah, you know, the decoupling question, I thought we talked about that earlier, really. I don't think this, what happened in Hong Kong, I don't think was a shock to anybody. That's the way China operates. That's what it does. And as we go forward, as I said, we're going to have to deal with these things. I don't know that they do want to decouple. I think what they want to do is exploit. And they can exploit because of their size to begin with, and other things that they have. I was told once by one of the Chinese representatives, they said, look, you Americans, you have these elections every 4 years, and your policy goes this way, and then a new administration comes in, you throw that all out the window. He says, we've got one plan. And we go forward with one plan, and that's how we've gotten to where we are. So they have some things that do benefit them in that regard. But this is something we're going to have to deal with as we go forward. But I'm not so sure it's a decoupling. I wouldn't sign on to that. I would say it's more that it's going to be an exploitation of the world around them.
I think we need to listen to their own words, Xi Jinping. What he said before his Congress when he got reelected as the imperial president. He wants imperial China back. And he's very clear. There's no gray area to this. And he also talked about, hey, we're now an economic superpower, even though they get interest-free loans from the World Bank as a developing nation. But he says now we're going to be a technology superpower and a military dominating force. I take that very seriously. And I think with Hong Kong, we, Jim said, we knew that was going to happen. But Taiwan, deterrence is going to have to be the key. And that's why Ukraine is important. That's why getting these weapon sales into Taiwan. We signed off on 3 years ago on 10 weapon sales to Taiwan that have yet to go into country, which raises a whole nother issue about our defense industrial base. But deterrence is going to be really important. I don't think a military invasion or a blockade is their first option. I think it's probably more their last. But I do think the next event may be the election, right? President Tsai can't run again, and so they'll probably try to gin with the election like they did in the 90s with our presidential election. And so, but we got to be prepared, and it's going to be, unlike Ukraine, we can't just put weapons in Taiwan and they can defend themselves. They can't. And the United States and Japan and South Korea and Australia, we're going to have to make a decision that the American people are. What's going to be the appetite and the will of the American people if that happens?
Do either of you want to comment on Afghan refugees? What more can we do?
Well, I think the comment that was made is underscoring the fact that there's so many other things going on. It's not getting the attention that it should get. It's there. We know about it. It gets discussed regularly, but because of the other things that are going on, we haven't moved things along as much as they should. The Afghan Adjustment Act, I don't know whether it's going to pass this year or not, Mike. I don't know whether you have a feeling on that or not.
Would you like to make a bet? We're on the record.
What's that?
We're on the record. You can make a bet.
I mean, the must-pass bills are probably the best. That would be our end-of-year.
CR.
But, Afghanistan was a disaster, right? And to put the Taliban in charge of HKIA and our security, and a suicide bomber gets in, kills 13 servicemen and women. We left thousands of American citizens behind. The State Department didn't have a plan. We have hundreds of thousands of Afghan partners now at the mercy of the Taliban that are getting tortured and killed by them. And we promised them we would save them. I'm going to hold hearings. I'll be the next chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I'm going to hold hearings on this because fundamentally the veterans deserve to know the answer. They need to know what happened and why did it go so badly and how this will maybe never happen again. But I think, one of the problems is it was so chaotic that a lot of Afghans got on the planes that shouldn't have. And so that's tainting the pool, if you will. But the ones we promised, they had a SIV, visa, 100% we should honor that.
I think in closing on the Afghanistan thing, and we'll move on, but probably if there's a lesson that we learned there, and it was a 20-year, $2 trillion lesson, we spent 20 years and $2 trillion trying to give something to somebody that didn't want it. And, today, is it any different than it was when we got there? The folks there, we gave them everything we could, including training of their military and everything else, and they didn't want it. And so here we are. The Ukrainian situation is very different than that. We're dealing with people who really want it, and so it's a different situation.
Although, as we heard this morning, the Afghan women may yet have a say eventually.
Hopefully.
Hopefully.
But that's the saddest thing, are the women left behind. I got 4 school buses of these music students, women, out of there through the Abbey Gate, and it was like, they call it like Schindler's List. You get out, you're going to live. If you don't, and the Sharia law is coming back in, and it's a horrible, and the poverty is massive.
So time is running short. I think we could take maybe one more question.
Or did you want to ask his?
I'm a little, I know, so did you want to discuss just the partners really quickly?
I forgot the question.
So the question was, what are we doing to make sure we don't leave our partners behind as we protect our national security interests through protecting our critical technology?
Long discussion, but I can tell you we are well aware of that. We're working with them. It takes, particularly as we try to produce weapons as we go forward, it is going to take us all coming together with the allies we have, and we have some good and important allies. It's going to take that as we go forward to counter what China's doing, and for that matter, what Russia's doing.
Okay.
And so I think the Five Eyes is such a good model for this, right? And we're in Canada. They're one of the 5. So, we work together and share intelligence and the technology. We're working with Australia to make submarines. It's going to take a while because the Taiwan Straits is important. So I think we got to continue that core for sure. And then this ITAR restrictions on hiring, workers like engineers that there are Canadians that we want to hire in the United States to make weapons, but we can't do it because of that. And it seems to me we could get some sort of exception for, workers from the Five Eyes to collaborate together.
Well, we have a poster child for that right now, too, is the NASAMS that we're all hearing about right now that are very, very successful in Ukraine, and that we need to get more of them there. Partially made by Sweden, partially made by the United States. It's a great collaborative effort. We're going to see more and more of that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative because we only have a few minutes left. But the Earth is on fire and melting. Many national security experts believe that even though obviously we have to deal with the threat, the very real threat posed by Russia and China, but the environment, we need to do something about climate change. What do you gentlemen think that we can do in a bipartisan fashion in the next Congress?
Well, I think that the world, America, and everyone is focused on climate change, and for that matter, getting to a reduced carbon environment. I think both sides need to come to some realizations. The one side needs to understand you can't flip a switch on this. This is not going to happen. A lot of people want to flip the switch and say we're going to change overnight. That is not going to happen. The other side needs to redouble its efforts and move towards a carbon-free environment, but it's going to take time. Everyone has to accept it's going to take time.
So I think innovation, technology, I'll give you, instead of putting mandates that ties us to China, which won't recognize the agreement, things like the small modular nuclear reactors. These are portable. They're about the size of a truck. The DoD has a project under DARPA. It'll be ready in 2 years. 0 carbon emissions. Think about that. And so even the EU passed, I should say even, the EU passed through their parliament saying that nuclear is in fact green energy. But there's always been this debate with the environmentalists about nuclear. That's when we had the big nuclear plants that, that had some problems with that. And I don't know if Chris Coons is out there, but he and I and Jim are looking at an amazing opportunity, I think, we have all these billionaires signed up, but they need USG to help partner with them to invest in stabilization, conservation, like in Africa, like with the game there, but also protecting the rainforest in the Amazon, in the Congo, and then Indonesia. And those are the lungs of the world. And think what an impact that would have.
We're making those in Idaho, by the way, the micro and the small.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, public-private partnership is definitely an area, I think, of greater growth. We've seen it in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, and hopefully we'll see it in the context of climate change.
And it stabilizes these countries where, there's terrorism breeding in these countries.
So thank you, gentlemen, both for your pretty quick, comprehensive participation in this panel. Thank you all for your participation. Please join me in a round of applause.